All right. Thanks so much and take it away, Nate.
All right. Hey, everybody. Thank you for coming. Just give me a minute here while I get the screen up. And here we go. Get this out of the way. Okay, so we're here today to talk about the neighbor-to-neighbor alerts network that we set up through the Piermont Waterfront Resiliency Task Force. So a little history about the task force. We had a task force in 2013 after Superstorm Sandy, and one of the recommendations from the task force roadmap was that we create a permanent commission, the Piermont Waterfront Resiliency Commission, which has the goal of continuing to inform our residents and plan for, fund, and build a more resilient future for Piermont. So one of those programs that we created is the N2N system. And the N2N system has 3 levels of engagement. The most basic is just simply receiving an alert. The next one is signing up to be a neighborhood leader who would check in on people in their neighborhood in an emergency situation. And then the third level is requesting a special needs check-in. So if we have residents that have a certain medical condition, they need to have equipment running and we have a power outage, they would inform us of that and we would be able to then make sure that they had what they needed in an emergency. So in order to organize this, we worked with a framework that we created through a project called the Neighborhood Liaisons Project, where we looked at Piermont and we divided it into 10 different neighborhoods that all shared similar risk profiles for flooding events. So the map that you see on the right is a map of Piermont as broken up into the various different neighborhoods that we're using for N2N. So when people register for the N2N system, they get alerts which inform them about what they need to do to stay safe and also what they need to do to facilitate our village response and recovery, just proceeding without any impediment after and during some kind of a flood event. So here's how we do it. The first thing that we do is we spend some time monitoring and gathering forecast data. So a few years back, I came up with the phrase to try to organize people's thoughts about how to be ready and be more resilient for flooding. That was step 1, be aware, step 2, prepare, and step 3, get out of there. So this is step 1. There's a bunch of different places that you can get good information about weather impacts and forecasts. And so we find it helpful to tap into a variety of different sources and aggregate all that together, but it can be a lot of work. So some of the sources that we look at is number 1, the Stevens Flood Advisory System. Number 2, we have advisories that get sent by NOAA and the National Weather Service that are full of very excellent specific information. I'm also signed up for a program called New York Alert, which sends similar advisories to the NOAA advisories, but they're a little bit different. And I also like to look at the new experimental National Weather Service flood extent mapper, which correlates a bit to the map that you see over on the right, which are the ABFEs in Piermont for the 100-year and 500-year flood. So those FEMA maps are also a resource that we use to try to figure out where we're going to need to focus our response capabilities. I also am a fan of using a website called wonderground.com. It provides weather forecasting and also is tied into a bunch of weather stations. So you can get localized information on things like what amount of rainfall have we actually seen in the last 3 hours. And of course, there's local media for us here in Piermont. It's News 12. They have a weather forecast that, runs every half an hour or so. And they also have crews out in the field, capturing images of what kind of conditions look like. Another source of information that's been useful is that our local utility company, which is Orange and Rockland Utilities, sends out to municipalities prior to a forecast storm event what numbers they're using, what concerns they have, and what amount of response capability they have ready to go. So that's a lot of different stuff. They don't always agree with each other, but there's always a good amount of overlap. And so I try hard in crafting these messages not to say, I'm telling you this, but to refer and defer to outside authorities. And so I'll say, according to the National Weather Service, this is how much it's going to rain. According to the Stevens Flood Advisory System, this is how much it's going to flood. So then moving on, we're really lucky that we have a Stevens station right here in the village. At the end of our pier, there is a tide gauge. And the thing that's unique about the Stevens system is that it's not just telling you what has occurred, it also has a forecast based on 15-minute intervals of sampling and their weather forecast. So this is really the best source of information for us about what kind of a surge event we're going to see. And then next, this is the new National Weather Service experimental flood extent mapper. The graphic you see on the left is a map again of Piermont and indicating by color minor, moderate, and major flood extent where it will be on the ground. And so we had a couple of storms in December and January that I was able to actually look at this map and then go and look at those locations and cross-reference that with the tide gauge at the end of the pier. And it looks like this is pretty spot on to what we actually see. So hopefully eventually it becomes non-experimental. And we can use it as an official forecasting tool for communities up and down the Hudson, but the information is pretty useful. And as I mentioned before, the weather forecasts from Wonderground, they localize and quantify what's going on right here because we have residents in Piermont and neighboring communities that have weather stations that are tied into Wonderground. You can look right at a particular station and see what is the rainfall rate per hour, how much total rainfall have we gotten, and we have some metrics that can translate that into where is it that we're going to have a problem here in Piermont. So of course, also watches and warning notices, they're useful because even though I try to check all this stuff every day, I might miss it a day. But if I get an email that says there's a flood watch on for tomorrow, I can remind myself to say, okay, I'm going to go back and check exactly what we're looking at. So on your left here, you see this is a screen grab from the Weather Underground website. And there's 4 charts there, and it really puts together the information in a very useful way. So the top one is showing you temperatures and barometric pressure and humidity and dew point. And then in the middle, there's what the chance of precipitation is, and the purple means snow, where the blue means rain. And it's done like by hour. So the National Weather Service watches will tell you sort of generalized information. This whole region, the whole county is under a watch, and it could rain or snow this amount, but it always says locally higher possible. The Weather Underground forecast is actually by zip code, and in my experience has been pretty spot on for what we're actually going to see on the ground. But like I said before, you got to put it all together. So I don't want to rely just on Weather Underground. But if I take some information out of the National Weather Service warning and then I cross-reference it, having the ability to also look at what the wind rate and direction is going to be by hour, that's the bottom chart on the left, is also super helpful because one of the weather factors that impacts what happens in Piermont is if we have a wind coming from the northeast, we have a bite where our pier meets the coastline, where waves tend to accumulate and amplify each other. And so depending on the wind, a certain elevation may be not a big deal or a actually big deal. So then after we've gone through that process and we've developed a pretty good idea about what it's going to look like, the next step we have to do is we've got to coordinate with our village, municipal, and emergency services. So what I do is I reach out to the police department, the fire department, and the DPW. I give them an idea of what the storm is going to look like and when, and then I have a conversation with them about what plans they're going to make in order to deal with this event. So some of those things are we have portable message boards that we can deploy in areas that are likely to flood, saying turn around, don't drown, flooding expected from this hour to this hour. And that can be kind of useful. Although a lot of people drive right past the sign that says don't drive down this road, it's flooded, and then call for help because they got stuck. But we can try by informing them. Other things that we do is the police department sometimes will proactively just close off a roadway if we know that it's going to be flooded for the next 6 or 8 hours, and also close off parking lots that we have that flood. One of the policies we developed after Sandy was that in Piermont, we have a prohibition on street parking overnight, but during a flood emergency, we waive that overnight parking restriction. And we also sometimes stage or relocate equipment because one of our DPW yards is in the flood zone. And if we're going to have a bad flood, our firehouse can get isolated, become an island, and have our equipment trapped in there. So we have a procedure in place in the firehouse operating guidelines to take equipment out of the firehouse and stage it on high ground to allow us to respond if the flood gets to the point where we can't get out of the firehouse. So all of this planning and those conversations also inform what goes into the messaging that we're sending out. So here's an example of an N2N email, and they're intended to provide the most current information we have. And there's always a bit of a balance because I want to give people enough time to prepare, but weather forecasts tend to change every 6 hours or so. So I don't want to send out an alert 3 days before an event because it could be a significant difference in what actually happens and what is in the most recent forecast from the one I looked at 3 days ago. What I like to try to include in these messages is a comparison to recent events that people will still have fresh in their mind and specific locations that we know are going to experience this kind of an issue. So I got some feedback from one of these messages that we sent out in December that there was a resident whose street wasn't listed, but did in fact flood. And so he contacted me and specifically requested, why can you include my street in those notices? Because you included the street that I connect to, but not my street. And I thought that meant I wasn't going to flood. So I'm happy to do that. And so in this message that we have on the screen here, I did in fact include that additional street, and they were thankful of it. You'll notice that I have the address information covered up with a box there. And that's a point that I just wanted to make, is that the way that this program works is we ask people to provide their personal email address and also their cell phone number, because SMS messages are another part of this program. But that's personal confidential information. People don't really want to have that shared around. And so I try to be really careful that we don't ever send out messages that aren't related to an emergency situation or share the email addresses and cell phone numbers that have been provided with anybody for any reason. But essentially just reading through it starts out pretty generic. Winter storm warning has been issued for our area overnight. This would happen to be February 12th to February 13th. So I pulled that out of the National Weather Service alert. And then snowfall of 8 to 12 inches with rates of 1 to 2+ inches per hour are forecast. The storm surge will elevate high tide Tuesday around noon to 4 to 4.5 feet, NAVD 88. And roads will need to be kept clear for DPW to perform snow removal work during this time. So previously I mentioned that part of what we're trying to communicate to people is how they can help work with the village. And this scenario is one of the ones that is the most challenging for us in Piermont, because if we're just going to have a flood, it's pretty easy. We waive overnight parking and we tell everybody park on high ground and your car isn't going to get trashed. When we have a snowfall event, we need our DPW to be able to get snow plows around the village and do snow removal. And if cars are parked on the street, that's problematic. And so this is the one situation where we can't have it both ways. So it's always a bummer to send out a message not saying move your car to high ground so it doesn't get flooded. But I have to say roads will need to be kept clear for our DPW to perform snow removal, because that can be really dangerous. So then the next thing I go into is trying to be a little bit more specific about when things are going to go on. So peak snowfall rates are forecast between 4 a.m. and noon, and will come along with 15 to 25 miles an hour. Winds from the north-northeast with gusts up to 40 miles an hour. Wind-driven waves may add an additional foot or more of water elevation to riverfront locations. Wind and heavy wet snow may bring down trees and cause a loss of power. And I always mention the loss of power thing because in Piermont, a lot of our homes have sump pumps that are plugged in and run fairly frequently. And so people don't think about how often their sump pump is kicking on and pumping water out of the basement until the lights go out and it stops doing it. But that really is a game changer for us. As long as the power stays on, in a number of these flooding situations, people get water in the basement and their sump pump pumps it out. If there's no electricity, it's within an hour, it's like a crisis. Everybody's basement is filling up. So then the next paragraph, I go into when we expect to have the elevated water situation. And something that's actually kind of typical is that the tides have cycles. And when there's a storm surge that's elevating the river, it's very common for there to be one flood event and then 12, 13 hours later, another flood event related to the same surge just on both of the high tides. So this was one of those situations where I wanted to give people the heads up. It's not just one, be ready for two of them. And then describe specific impacts at specific locations. Above 4 feet, we typically see flooding in Lot D, the River Lot, on Paradise Ave, Ohio, Laddick, and Bridge Streets. Heavy snowfall accumulations may reduce the ability of our stormwater systems to allow tidal surge to dissipate, especially in low-lying areas. And that's very true. The snow clogs up the storm drains, and when it's right around freezing or below freezing, they freeze over on the storm drains, and water that's pooled in the roadway just stays there. So I always want to try to qualify that. Every time we have one of these events, I get phone calls saying, when is it going to be done? Why isn't it draining? And, you know, there are actual reasons why that's going on. So I want to just prepare people for that. And of course, I always tell people to check the Stevens Institute. I believe at this point there are only 2 residents, and one of them is Klaus, that consistently look at the Stevens Institute, even though I put it in every single email. And I also provide the information about notifying the power company about a loss of power. And of course, you always want to say, turn around, don't drain. So then what I do for a living is I make databases. And what we've gone over so far is very similar to what Julie from Kingston presented a couple of months ago at another FRN, where she's using Stevens Flood Advisory to get an idea where there's going to be a situation. And then she's sending out an email directly to a group of 30 people, I think was about where she was at when she gave that presentation. And just giving them a heads up about what it looks like is going to happen. And that can be super useful. And that's basically what we've gone over so far. But as we get larger, it doesn't scale very well. So basically managing a listserv can be challenging. You got to keep track of all these email addresses. How are you going to do it? Do you just put a contact in your Outlook that has 50 names in it? Well, that can get you in trouble. So one of the issues I touched on before was about the confidentiality of this information. And if you send out an email to 50 people all CC'd, each one of the recipients can see every other recipient's email address. And if they chose to, send them an email or sign them up for spam or something like that. So people are generally uncomfortable having their email included on a CC list. And if you do a BCC list instead, then you look like a spammer. So you can get away with that when you're sending 20 emails, 30 emails, 50 emails. When you get above 75, 100 emails that you're sending at a time, basically all of the heuristic spam blocking programs see that and say, this is a problem that should get flagged. And the most important thing about this process is that the message gets delivered. So I've been very careful to try to structure this in such a way that we don't look like spam whenever possible. And we don't get blacklisted, so the messages do get delivered. So the thing is, there's Microsoft Office tools that can help. Microsoft Access is a database program that is relatively simple to use, doesn't require any fancy database administration, and is integrated with Office, so you can do Office automation. So what I realized as our list started growing, and I was getting to the point where I was sending out between emails and SMS messages, like 150 messages, I was getting bounce backs. I was getting listed on spam. And I said, I've got to have a better way to do this. So I set up a database. That's what I do. And when I'm thinking about setting up a database, I'm thinking about databases are all about correlating different pieces of information. So what I decided to do was I pulled our tax lot records for Piermont, and I created a table that was all of the properties in Piermont. We have 1,120 tax lot records. We have a population of about 2,500. So when I pulled in all those addresses, The next thing I did was I added a column in the table to store what their N2N neighborhood was. I also included a series of checkboxes to indicate if they had NFIP insurance, if they were in the AE zone, the VE zone, or the X zone, and also if they if they currently were in repetitive loss status with the NFIP program. I also, in the situations where I have an elevation certificate for a property, I included the elevation certificate elevation. And in places where I didn't, I tried to approximate what their NAVD 88 elevation was on the property. So now I took the list of people who have signed up and I created another table. And these are our N2N signups, and I have their home address, and now I can associate it with an actual property tax parcel. And that gives me the ability to send out alerts by specific neighborhoods or just to everybody. And the default is just send it to everybody that signed up. But we do have that ability to look at it more granular. So let's see what that looks like. Here's a screenshot of the notifier database. And what we have in the upper left is a list. It's blank. I cleared out all the records, so nobody is going to get mad at me for receiving spam. But in the upper left, we have residents who have signed up and want alerts. In the upper right, we have residents who have signed up and are willing to be neighborhood leaders and check in on people. And in the lower right, we have a list of people who have requested check-ins. And then the lower left is where the action actually happens. So in that little gray box there that says SMS 0, 130 max, you can type a message in and that will be sent by SMS. But I have to qualify this here for a second because when I originally set this database up, you were able to do something that was called email to text. Every cell phone carrier had an email address associated with every cell phone number that would be like your cell phone number at Verizon.net. And so the way I was doing the SMS was I was sending an email to the carrier's SMS endpoint. And that has now been deprecated. You can't do that anymore. It all gets immediately just bounced back. And so what I did do recently, and I'm asking for a budget in our current budget year for this, is I signed up for a service called Twilio. And Twilio has a web API that you can submit SMS messages to, and they will send it from a virtual phone number as an actual SMS message. But there's a fee associated with it. It costs 0.7 cents per message sent up to 130 characters. So I'm hoping to get the SMS messages going back again this year once I get the village to approve paying the penny per message that it'll cost. But beneath that, we have your basic components of an email, a subject and a body. And there's also an attachment off on the right. When I initially set this up, I thought that the attachment would be useful because I could put the graphic of the tide chart, or I could put a flood extent map or something along those lines. But after doing a little bit of research, it turns out that having an attachment is something that increases your spam factor rating. So I have not been doing that because, as I said before, the most important thing here is making sure that the messages get delivered. So what we do send is a really boring email that just has a subject and a body, and it's all text except for the one link to the Stevens advisory, because that's the way to get the best not spam rating. So then another thing that we do, another layer of our outreach in these situations is we do have a social media presence. We have a Waterfront Resiliency Commission page and group, and this is the place where the graphics come into play. So our thought is that posting on social media reinforces the information that we're sending out as a message. And one thing I always try to be careful about is that it's easy to fall into the trap of thinking I posted it on Facebook, so now everybody is aware of it. But at least in our community, a lot of people aren't on Facebook. The email component really is essential because I've got lots of folks that get the email and thank me for the information, but never see what's on Facebook. But having a graphic there with a chart, I think, is actually quite helpful for a lot of people that are more sort of visually oriented. And using the same chart over and over again also gets people familiar with it and builds up that sort of memory of, oh, I remember when it was in the orange last time, there was a foot of water in my house. So this is a useful tool, but it's not a replacement for the direct messaging outreach. So what are some of the benefits of doing this? Well, one of the things that goes on in, at least in our community in Piermont here, is that when individual property owners see flood impacts, they feel very isolated and they feel like nobody's there to help them out. And they would really like somebody to be there to help them out. So we send out these messages, we put these things on Facebook, but then what really seals the deal is while the event is going on, myself and other people from the village, people from our fire department will actually be going door to door, checking in if people need a pump out, talking to them, asking if they got the notification, if they were aware of it, if they want to sign up. And that really reinforces the trust and or builds the trust if it didn't exist in the first place that Piermont is on their side and we're working with them to try to figure things out. So letting people know what the specific risks are is going to help them prepare, and it's going to mean there are fewer totaled cars every time we have a high tide. Leads to better outcomes. But in some cases, it's just as simple as move your car. In some cases, it's going to be more complicated, and it's going to be get the things that you need to be outside of the home for a few days and evacuate. So the more concise and actionable information we can provide, I feel like it helps de-stress the events for the residents. People new, especially people that are new to the area and haven't experienced tidal flooding before. It's all very confusing and overwhelming. So I like to try to be as specific as possible. If I have an idea of the number of inches of rainfall per hour, we have an idea of what amount of rainfall our stormwater system can deal with in an hour before things start to go sideways. We have an idea of how much total accumulation of rainfall we can have in a 24-hour period before things are just a catastrophe. And we have an idea of where is going to flood based on the inundation depth and wave height. So when we do a comparison to recent events, it was really easy to do in December and January because we had 3 events in a 4-week period. So I got to say, remember what it looked like last week? It's going to be a little bit higher this week. And that kind of explanation makes sense to people. It communicates well. Simply saying a number is requiring them to do thinking on their end to turn that number into what it looks like on the ground. And not everybody is equipped to do that, especially when they're stressed out. So another thing that having the database does for us is it creates a catalog of the storm events that have happened with specific details about the forecast for each one. So one of the people that's on the email list is one of our county emergency coordinators. And so he receives a notification about what impacts are going to be like in Piermont. And then typically after the event or during the event, we'll reach out to me and see, did it come in as bad as it looked like? Is there anything that you need from county? And that, you know, if we have a serious situation, there are plenty of circumstances where we would need some assistance from county. And having them looped into this whole process is helpful for them and helpful for us. And then another benefit that I feel is something that comes out of these messages is that we are a coastal community. We have a lot of boaters. We have people that are familiar with tide charts, but the tide charts are all in different metrics. So people will get confused and say, you're telling me the tide's going to be 4.5 feet, but I'm looking on Willy Weather and it says 5.5 feet. What's going on? And that's because Willy Weather is using not an AVD 88. And then some of the forecasts will refer to mean high water. And they use the acronym MHHW. There's an alphabet soup that people that have been dealing with these kinds of issues for a few years can fall into the trap of thinking everyone understands what they're talking about when they put some letters on a piece of paper. And in reality, most of our residents don't care to really learn about what any of those numbers mean or what the difference between them is. So we like to try to standardize it. We're always using the NAVD88. We're always going to mention if you're in the inundation zone or if you're in the X zone or if you're in the VE zone, because we want people to understand those. So those are what are on the advisory-based flood elevation maps. That's what the flood insurance company is going to be interested in. So we get to do some education, we get to do some standardization, and hopefully understanding the information that's coming in, again, makes it less stressful. You know what that means, so it's not like, oh my God, this is confusing. What does that mean? So then what do you have to do to actually put a program like this into place? I'm sure we're going to have some questions about this, so I figured I'd preemptively go through some of the things. First thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to research what forecast resources you have. We happen to have a Stevens gauge right in the village. Not everybody's going to have that. One of the things that Julie has to do up in Kingston is there's a Stevens flood advisory gauge, but it's upstream from her a little bit, and there's a time delay. So she's got to look at that gauge and then add some time onto when the peak is and say, okay, this is what the impacts are going to be for us here. That's something that's entirely doable. It's a little bit easier for us in Piermont not having to do that, but each community that's interested in trying to develop a program like this is going to need to figure out what's the best source. So the National Weather Service is always good, but as we looked at before, it's not super localized. It's kind of county-wide forecasts, and there can be a lot of variation from one end of county to another, especially in a rainfall event. If Wonderground, if there are people that have local Wonderground gauges in your area, that could be something that would be useful to you as well. So you want to do a little research there and check out what it is that you're going to be using as the basis of the messages that you're sending out. Then the next thing is in terms of the database requirements. Just because I'm a database wonk doesn't mean everybody has to be. You don't necessarily need to have a program where there are check-ins and there are community leaders. You don't necessarily need to track each individual property and the NFIP information about it. You could just have a table of just people that want a message and the message that I sent out. But so that's something that you have to, identify in your own community what is useful or not useful. And then the next thing is establish what communication channels you're going to use. So email is the most basic one. SMS, a lot of people prefer getting an SMS text message. It forces me to get it down to 130 characters, and 130 characters is a lot easier to read than 600 characters in a full email address. But it also means I can't always include all the same details. It'll be more of a summary. And like I mentioned before, you can't do them for free anymore. So if you want to send out SMS, you're going to have to set up an account with Twilio or something similar to that and get some budget out of your municipality to cover the expense of sending them. And then the last one is social media. Like I said before, no replacement for actually sending messages, but certainly a useful place to get some information out there for people that may be less inclined to read an email or understand it or just spend a lot of time on Facebook. And then the next thing you want to do is you want to develop and vet the message language and the terminology that you're using. So when we first started doing this, I think the first dozen emails that I sent out to N2N, I actually sent out to our mayor and our board of trustees beforehand to confirm that they were comfortable with the language that I was using. I'm always very careful not to take, not to take ownership of the information and say, I say it's going to flood. I want to refer to that outside authority and say the Stevens Institute says it's going to flood. The National Weather Service says we're going to have a lot of rain, and use language that is very sort of generalized and doesn't make anybody panic. But each community that wants to do something like this, you're going to have to get your stakeholders comfortable with the types of language you're using and what terminology you're going to use. So I would reach out to your elected officials and emergency services and get feedback from them on what they think is the right way to get this messaging out to the community. And then the next thing is you're going to have to assign that monitoring duty and also the duty of sending the notification itself out, creating the notification and sending it out to somebody. So in most municipalities, this would be something that somebody in the clerk's office does, and staff time is required for this. Here in Piermont, because I'm a glutton for punishment, I just do it myself. But it would be better if it could be somebody's job instead of my hobby. And then the last thing is just establish a policy that you're going to do this at the municipal level and start doing it. So not super complicated, but there are steps and there is work that's involved in doing it. And I just want to make sure that everybody goes into it with eyes open that that is the case. So then at that point, I'm on to questions and answers. And let me stop sharing the screen here so we can all see each other. Okay.
Great.
So does
Thank you
anybody have
very
any
much.
questions or thoughts?
Any questions for Nate? Oh, Julie, go ahead.
That was amazing. I feel like I thought I was like hitting all the boxes, like doing all this cool stuff for Kingston, and then Nathan comes in and is like, bam, we're doing what Julie's doing and more. And it's like, what? How are you doing all that? That's so amazing. There were so many similarities between what you said. I feel like you were speaking out of my own voice, and I have so many of the exact same circumstances that you're seeing. And I'm really, really happy that there's a community that has gone further than we've gone to like take the proactive actions that you've taken to figure out how to get in touch with folks. I feel like I could say ditto to everything you said. Really well done.
Well, so here's the thing, Julie, is this database that I put together, I'm happy to distribute it. Like I can email you a copy of it. You can put your email list into it and start using it. And that's sort of the intention. Okay. And that, I mean, that's open to anybody that wants to do this. It's just a free thing. I'll just email it to you. You just have to fill out the residence list and then you can start sending them.
Thank you.
Oh, I see there is a ditto in the chat from Julie.
The
Yeah,
ditto was for the part where you said, I'm a glutton for punishment and I choose to do it myself. And I was like, I got that going on.
Let's do Mary and then Emily Hauser.
Nate, that was great. And I'm in the village of Saugerties. So we have a system, but it misses events or it misses people. So absolutely, I'd love to try and incorporate your data into a system for our waterfront neighbor to neighbor communication. I wonder if there is a sort of an update information. And again, it's Jessica who helped us so much this winter with alerting us to certain floods. But what is the closest monitoring gauge to help for us mid-Hudson people? So I'm imagining that Saugerties is the same as Kingston.
Yeah, good question. Oh,
Yeah,
sorry.
no, go ahead, Jessica. I was going to defer to you anyway.
Yeah, I think with the Stevens flood advisory system, it is Norrie Point. We do have a tidal gauge at Turkey Point, but that is only reported in mean lower low water. And I'm not sure it does a forecast. So there's that disconnect with the datum you have to take into account with that one.
There's one.
Yeah, and we're also, what was that?
Tivoli has one.
Tivoli has one as well. Yep. And I just wanted to mention that for the counties, Ulster, Dutchess, and North, we also don't get coastal flood forecasts the same way that they do in the Southern Forecasting Office. So we have a bit of a communication lack there when it comes to tidal flooding specifically. Yeah.
Emily and then Julie.
Hi, Nate. My simple question was, what happens if the electricity goes out? Are people able to communicate? Or is it already kind of beyond, you've already communicated? Like, can they use their phone? Can they?
Well, so that's one of the things about text messages is that a lot of people check their email on their computer. And if the power is out, their computer is out. But their phone is probably still working. And most of the cell phone towers have backup generators. And so the cell service will probably still be effective. I get emails on my phone as well. So, but not everybody does that. Like my mom, for example, she gets a text message on the phone, but she doesn't have email set up on the phone. That only happens at the computer. So there's kind of two different aspects to it. And the other aspect is if the power goes out, can I send out a message? So we do have a backup generator at our firehouse, and I do have backup batteries in my home office, so I can run for a couple hours with no power. And I can go down to the firehouse if I need to. But generally, by the time the power is out, we're in response mode. And I want to have already gotten those messages out like at least 6 to 8 hours before we're in response mode. So I mentioned earlier, you want to send it out as soon as possible, but you also want to wait for the most up-to-date weather forecast. And I try to use that no less than 6 to 8 hours before an event. If the event's supposed to be at like 3 in the morning, I mean, okay, maybe I'll send that out by 5 p.m. because I'm going to be asleep when the next update comes in. And so I'm not going to be able to give you any better information. And you'll probably be asleep too. So you won't even get the message.
Mhm. And so as long as the cell phone towers, you're pretty much relying on cell phone towers. And so as long as the cell phone towers are working, then most of the people would get the message. I just wanted to say that I experienced during Sandy that Hoboken flooded and Stevens went off. They were gone. You couldn't get that information right during that. But thank you. And did you say you're doing this all on your own time?
I am, yes.
And you've learned all this also. Well, good for you. That's great. Just like Julie. So.
Full disclosure, I am not doing this on my own time. I am getting paid.
Oh,
She's smarter than me.
Yeah, go ahead, Julie. And then
I
Klaus.
just wanted to say, to address the question about not having gauges locally. So Nathan is spot on. We do not have one locally right now. We're relying on either Poughkeepsie or Norrie Point. However, we, as in the administration and myself, have been in very close communications with USGS to reinstate a previously deactivated station here in Kingston. And just simply started with like hey, we know there used to be one here. Why isn't there anymore? Who used to pay for it? How much does it cost? What kind of information will we get from it? Are you even interested in doing it? And they basically were like, yes, we're totally interested in doing it. Just give us the money. And so we are moving forward with the Rondo Extreme Gauge. It's going to be at the Maritime Museum, which is where it was before. And they gave me the costs, and so this would be, I could either pay for it to have just stage data, meaning how high the water is, or stage and discharge, meaning like how much water is flowing over this space. And for the record, the cost differential is huge between those two things. So we are going with the just tell me how deep it is stage option, which is $25,000 to set it up, and then $10,000 to $12,000 a year, versus a $52,000 to set it up and a $35,000 to $38,000 per year if you want the other data. So we've been in communication with Congressman Ryan's office and looking and figuring out how we're going to pay for this. If we don't get federal funding or regional funding for it, we're just going to pay for it out of our pockets. And that way, because what we also see in Kingston, I may have mentioned this before, is that we've got all this going on with the river, and then we also have the Rondo Creek that's coming in and influencing it. So at least for those of you who need a closer gauge, if you're in the Kingston area, you will then have ours.
That's amazing, Julie. That's going to be a huge breakthrough. Klaus, over to you.
Yeah, I simply wanted to comment and say we are so extraordinarily lucky to have a person in Nate who is a database expert, B, is part of the fire department, and is part of the village government, and is a smart guy to begin with. So that combination is very rare, and you sometimes may have to rely on more than one person in your community if you want to get this really going and sustained. And what if the guy is on vacation or a woman is on vacation or whatever? So you really have to think about an operation 24/7, 365. Not just when you are ready and willing to do it. So that's one thing. And now some internal issues. I recently started with Nate a conversation or text message or email where I felt that we had the threshold too high for sending out messages. Why is that so? Because I happen to live in this one flood zone neighborhood district called Bogatown. and we are the lowest lying in the village. And so sometimes we have problems here in our neighborhood where it's not worth alarming the whole village about it. And yet the escape routes are essentially high enough flooded that people may have difficulties driving through it when it's too late. So I think to think about neighborhood-specific alerts may, Nate, become sort of a necessity sooner or later. I think it's already there. And other communities may want to think about it without putting the whole village in alarm mode when it's really not needed and it's highly localized flooding. So these were two comments that I thought I should make here.
Yeah, and that's totally valid. And so I'll say that in my defense for using 4 foot as a threshold rather than something lower than 4 foot, part of it is just the mere selfishness that if it's 3.5 foot, I have to send out 5 times as many messages, and I have to go through the same process as if it was above 4 feet in order to get a good message put together and delivered to everybody. So your point to having more than one person working on this or having village staff assigned to it, that's very valid. The amount of bandwidth that I have is somewhat limited by needing to actually make a living as well as do this. So I've made those trade-offs in, okay, if it's above 4 foot, we have problems in like 4 different neighborhoods. If it's below 4 foot, we have a problem in Bogertown. But I do have the system set up so I can send a message just to Bogertown. So that is something that we should talk about.
Well, and I think you should look for volunteers, and here I officially volunteer to make a highly localized just for the 12 residences in Bogertown here when I see something in the making. In fact, that's what I have been doing in the past without you knowing. But I think maybe something can be organized in other communities in a more site-specific fashion.
That's fair.
And with 12 notifications, you don't run into all those spam problems that you have with the big messaging.
I want to go over to Simon's question. He's got his hand up, but I also want to reflect on, I think, the uniqueness that Klaus mentioned of Nate, your skill set, and all of the different hats you wear, and thinking about the role of the Hudson Valley Flood Resilience Network, where, thank you, Nate, for developing this database based on your specific skill set that others who may not have that skill set can then benefit from, whether it's City of Kingston, Village of Saugerties, right, the other folks who are on this call. So I hope that through the network, we can do more of this, where we can leverage strengths. If there's communications materials that we can share across the municipalities, if there's other tools that can help streamline this, because the lack of resiliency of the resilience system is a real challenge, that it's like one person, a limited amount of time, right? And we want to make sure that we're, to the extent possible, helping relieve some of that capacity burden. So Simon, over to you.
Hello. So this was fascinating, Nathan. I'm going to have to watch this whole thing again and take more notes and probably be calling you for advice. I live in Cornwall, actually in Cornwall and Hudson, the village. And I just wanted to briefly mention something we just did recently that may be useful for people as we go forward here. And I spoke to Jess about this. I haven't really talked to anyone else who's watching, I don't think. With Professor Bill Selecki at Hunter College, who's a leading researcher on climate resilience, and 2 of his graduate students, we did a workshop on using a tool they prepared over a period of years called the Post-Extreme Event Learning Tool, that's designed to help communities or organizations work through a quick process to have the right people in the room with a guided workshop to discuss what happened in a storm, how to plan for the future. And one of the interesting things that we were anticipating they had not used this before hardly at all, other than one community board in New York City several years ago after, I don't remember which storm, but it was a 3-hour workshop. We had 14 people from the town and village. We also had our state assemblyman, Chris Ekus, who also represents Highland Falls and Highland, where there was worse flooding damage in the July 9th flooding last year. This was upland flooding. This was not coastal. But we surmised that I said when we were planning this, I had not seen this process before. I didn't really understand it well. I said, it may be true in towns like this that it doesn't happen. And this was, months after the storm, not right away. So people had time to do the immediate, work and then think about it. And we learned, in fact, it was true. One of the participants, I'm not supposed to attribute comments to anyone who was in the room. That's our rule. But one of the key people who's a town official said, in 7 years working here, I've never been in a meeting like this at the end. And it was extremely successful. It was an amazing success. And they all felt clearly that they wanted to meet again. And I was paid temporarily through the CC Run Regional Climate Adaptation Network program. Bill has some of that money each year to organize this over a period of several months. We're out of money for that now, but we're going to look for more. And to finish up, our emergency management coordinator for the town and village, who also does the same thing as a volunteer for Highlands and Highland Falls, and our village water superintendent, the water system serves the town and village, police chief, town supervisor, and representative from Senator James Skoufis's office were in the room, and 2 people from Black Rock Forest, which had their own damage, which was featured on the front page of the New York Times in a picture, were all in the room, and we met at Black Rock. So I just wanted to let you know we're doing this. It's called PELT, Post-Extreme Learning Tool, and the plan is to make this an open source tool and process with a guidebook they've developed that other communities can use. So I'd like to stay in touch with anyone here today who's interested in that. I'm hoping to go forward to work in Cornwall and keep our group going and maybe help others people do this. That's my comment. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much, Simon. And please keep us posted on the availability of that tool. That sounds like it'll be really, really useful for a lot of folks dealing with these issues. Julie, I see your hand is up, and then I think we will wrap it up.
Yeah, just quickly, a couple things. You were talking about things that would be able to cross throughout the flood resilience network. One of the things that we're doing in Kingston, because we're simultaneously also developing a comprehensive emergency management plan. So I've taken a lot of different trainings, FEMA trainings that are available to anyone for responding to emergencies and other things that fire departments would normally have, but like somebody like me has no experience at all. There is one actually coming up in May, which is called Flooding Hazards Science and Preparedness. It's called AWR 362. It's a FEMA training for 2 days. It's 8 hours of course, and it's free. And I recommend that people might take a look at it. But I also wanted to just say that we are going to be creating, we've been working with our local radio station to create canned responses. So like in advance, as opposed to us in emergency saying, oh my gosh, what are we supposed to say to the world? Like, how do we need to put out a statement, whether it's a text or on the radio or whatever. So we're preparing those in advance so that when we are level-headed and like understanding what that message is going to be. And so once we have those together, I can share those with folks as well. Or if you already have things like that, that would be helpful for me. I don't want to have to recreate the wheel.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and something I thought about mentioning in the presentation, but it didn't really seem to have the time for it. But that is kind of what I do. So once I got the language vetted and everybody was comfortable with, here are the words that we're going to use to describe it, when I do a new message, I go back to a previous message. I copy and paste it into a text editor, and then I change the dates, and I change the amounts, and I change the events. But I try to always use exactly the same language every time I'm talking about a rain event, every time I'm talking about a surge event, every time I'm talking about a snow event. And so having the database of the messages that has already been sent is a way to, provide that kind of sample language in her.
That's great. Yeah, and we can definitely create a repository too through FRN so that that's available to other folks as you're working on honing your messages and figuring out what's going to be best in your communities. So we hit our hour. So Nathan, thank you so much again. Huge virtual and physical round of applause. Your work has been amazing. There's so much for us to learn from and leverage throughout the region. Thanks everyone for coming to our Lunch and Learn. We will be in touch soon with more FRN programs, both our Lunch and Learn online and some in-person meetings coming up this year too. So we'll talk to you soon. See you over email.